Hello and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Mary Satchwell, one of the leaders of the Illinois School Psychologists Association. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will go ahead and get started with a quick welcome from Gabby Garibay, one of our Child and Professional Diversity Chairs.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our first ISPA Racial and Social Justice Town Hall panel discussion. My name is Gabby Garibay, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the ISPA Child and Professional Diversity Committee, as well as Dr. Crystal Shelvin. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We have developed an ISPA Social Justice work group, and the names of the work group members are on the screen. And we also like to acknowledge our ISPA original directors who continue to have great conversations, and hopefully after tonight, we'll have even more conversations with the members in their regions about social justice. At this time, I'd like to present our panelists for the evening. Dr. Brea Banks is an assistant professor of psychology at Illinois State University, where she also earned her PhD, specializing in school psychology. She also, in her current position, she worked in private practice, conducting psychological assessments and providing family therapy. Her research interests include cognitive consequences of microaggressions and student of color experiences in higher education. Dr. Catherine Campbell has practiced as a school psychologist for more than 20 years. She serves on the NASP Board of Directors as a delegate representative for the Central Region. She was also instrumental in the adoption of social justice as a NASP strategic goal, as well as a standalone NASP committee. She's also served on the NASP Social Justice Strategic Goal Planning Team and currently serves on the NASP Leadership Development Strategic Goal Planning Team and is a member of the Leadership Development Committee. Nakima Hudson completed her master's and education specialist degree in school psychology at Florida A&M University and holds an additional master's degree in school administration from Concordia University. Nakima has been a psychologist with Chicago Public Schools since 2005 and an administrator in the district since 2012. She currently serves as the co-chair of the African American Subcommittee within NASP. Dr. Dave Schreiberg is a professor and program chair for the school psychology program at Indiana University. He's one of the editors of the book School Psychology and Social Justice, Conceptual Foundations and Tools for Practice, and a co-author of NASP's recently released book, School Psychology in a Global Society, Rules and Functions. He's also a co-founder of NASP's Social Justice Interest Group and is a member of NASP's Social Justice Committee. We welcome all of our panelists this evening.
To begin our conversation tonight, Dr. Campbell is going to share a little bit about some of the foundations and context for our conversation tonight, as well as some of the efforts that ISPA has already started in this process.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us this evening. So this town hall was something that was very important to happen just in order for ISPA to provide some support for members to address questions that you may have as you prepare for the current school year, as you're working to help students, children, youth, as well as the families. It takes a lot. This current climate has really taken a toll on society as a whole. This year has been very devastating for many communities. And because of that, along with the work that ISPA already does, we felt that it was very important that the association provide some support for its association's members, for the school psychologists within the state, and to give some guidance. Current events are in the news every day, excuse me, and things are going viral. And the mental health for our children, our youth is so very important for their academic development, but also their physical and mental health, in order for them to not only be in school, but to thrive in school and to do well in life, and to learn to make good decisions and to know that there is a support base. So we wanted to make sure that as an association, we're providing a resource for you, an opportunity for you to reach out to other professionals and to hear not only what the panelists have to say this evening, but to make sure that you have your perspectives and your questions addressed, so that you can continue to do your work in an ethical and also following legal guidelines as you work with students. So ISPA, this summer, there was a call to action. There's a resolution that was drafted, and the board of directors, the governing board of ISPA adapted. So that was approved. It is available on the ISPA website under resources, and you can click on that social justice resolution for the state. And it's not just stating what ISPA believes in as far as supporting Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but also the actions that ISPA is intending to take. And this is one of those actions where ISPA is taking the charge to say, we want to be available to you, we want to address your concerns, and we want to make sure that you are supported in the work that you do to help children, youth, and families. Because parents need some support as well as they work with their children, especially given the remote situation that we're in. So we're looking at so many different dynamics, as far as the intersectionalities that children and families are facing. And so we want to, I don't like to use race, but we talk about racism all the time. But we really want to address how the disparities continue to plague our society in regards to culture and ethnicity and the differences between people, as opposed to us just being seen as all humans with equal access to and equity in all things. So thank you, and we'll let Mary continue.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. So to begin from hearing from each of our panelists, and I just wanted to note to everyone that Dr. Banks is here. Unfortunately, we're not able to see her on webcam, but she is here. And thank you all again for joining us. So to begin our conversation, if you don't mind sharing a bit about your current work related to racial and social justice in the field of school psychology in each of your different settings and roles. And then if you've encountered any barriers, what those might have been and how you have overcome those. Who would like to start? Anybody is welcome.
I'm happy to start.
Thanks, Nikki.
No problem. So I would say my work got started in social justice in 2017. I was actually tapped by Dr. Barrett to participate in the social justice task force within NAS. And in that work, we worked to develop a lesson plan for working professionals to utilize at their schools to begin conversations begin conversations about race and social justice. So I did that in collaboration with one of the past presidents of ISPA, actually, Daphne Perry, as well as Dr. Barrett, Dr. Avant, and Tiara Bland. We all worked on that document, and that was published back in 2017. I also was able to participate in the equity work group within Chicago Public Schools, which also continued to light a fire under me to really get involved in social justice work. In my time on that committee, we now have a department, an equity department, so that's awesome. But my time on that committee, again, gave me the opportunity to take some of the work that I was doing with them as well as with NASP and take that back to our colleagues, speech pathologists, school psychologists first, and then we opened that up to all of the related service providers within the district. Unfortunately, as administrators, we were hearing things in the field that just did not sit right with us. Things that RSP said to us directly as administrators. So thinking about that, we thought, well, if you felt comfortable enough to say this to us as an administrator, what are you saying to these families or students that you're working with? So we really felt it was important to begin to have these conversations with people. So again, we started with psychologists, speech language pathologists, and then we opened it up to all related service providers. Just this last year, we brought Dr. Celeste Malone in to address or to talk about microaggressions that happen in schools and how to respond to those microaggressions when you see them or experience them. So we felt like it was very important to continue this work. We've also been able to provide our presentation to principals at 2 principal institutes, one about 2 years ago and just this past summer. So we're really trying to continue this work because when we look at the data in Chicago Public Schools, the disproportionality is absolutely there. We can see it in students who are referred for either 504s or students who only have OHI service. You can look at the map within Chicago and tell where those, where those disability categories are being made based on students. Our data definitely shows that our Black and brown boys are more identified as having an ED label. So we take that data and we really wanted to have these conversations with our colleagues who were the ones at the table making these decisions about students. So that's where our work continues.
I can go next, and hopefully you all can hear me. This is Dr.
Yes.
Banks. Awesome. Well, I was trained as a school psychologist. My PhD program was at Illinois State. And I would say that my social justice journey really began there. And I would say that I really was pushed forward in my first job, and that was actually at Colorado State University, where I was not necessarily practicing as an academic, but working in their counseling center there as a provider that was specifically assigned to work with their student diversity programs and services offices. So I was particularly hired to work with students who held minoritized or marginalized identities. And being in that space and being around folks in student affairs who had done a ton of work, I really felt like I was able to grow a great deal in my journey, although at that point I had already had my PhD. But when I look at the growth that I had there, just being able to be in meetings and have discussions with folks, I really attribute a lot of my growth to that setting. The job opened up at Illinois State, and I was fortunate to be able to come home. And my research interests surround microaggression and more broadly social justice issues. But in our lab, we really focus on examining the cognitive consequences of microaggression, starting to look more, because there's not a ton of data out there. There aren't a ton of research studies that have been conducted to examine the impact of microaggression in school-age children, or just generally speaking, any research at all in that area. So we've been focused there. So from a research standpoint, that is my primary focus. From a teaching standpoint, in our school psychology program, we are really trying to push the ball forward, right? And just really, intentionally think about what our program is doing to best prepare our students to be able to provide culturally responsive services when they leave our program. And so I think that my mindset really surrounds the research that I'm engaged in and the way that we're training our students. And regarding barriers, I've been very fortunate to be at an institution research-wise that has been very supportive in my research agenda. And the same goes for when it comes to training our students. I have great colleagues who are also committed to pushing us forward. So I have been very fortunate not to experience a ton of barriers in that work. I think our students, and I know that we'll probably talk about this some today, our students struggle sometimes when they're in the school setting, and kind of like the point that Nikema made a minute ago, understanding how to respond when a supervisor engages in behavior that they feel is microaggressive, or they're in a meeting and someone says something to a parent, right, or parent or guardian. And so I find myself sometimes struggling with getting students to move along in their journeys. And that way, I would say that maybe that's the biggest thing that I find challenging But I would say that as they move along in their training, they become more comfortable when they have different practice experiences. And I'm happy to be here today to talk to you all about more of my experiences.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. All right, how
Okay, I'll
about,
go.
thanks, Catherine.
Okay, so as a practitioner, I feel like I've been doing social justice work since I started in grad school, being at a campus, and I'm very proud of my institution, but I was the only person of color in my cohort, which is not unique to school psychology as a field. So, just continuing to push to broaden the awareness amongst minority groups or minoritized groups about the field so that more can join us. Um, but especially when I was an intern in Chicago and just learning so much from my supervisors about the importance of, being mindful of the ethical, as well as the legality of the decisions that are made at the table on behalf of students. Because as Nakima mentioned, we have this, and everyone knows we have a very disproportionate amount of children of color who are identified more harshly. There's, there's that distinction that's always made in a perception just because you're a Black boy that it has to be bad, or if you're a Black girl, it has to be bad. And that's just just wrong. That's just wrong. And so just being mindful of the discipline um, procedures in schools and the referrals and the eligibility determinations that are made in schools, as well as the policing in schools, and how so many more Black boys are taken to the jailhouse as opposed to the schoolhouse. And so the levels of supports that are not there, it's just daily seeing the injustices and fighting for those children at the table. It's not always easy, but it's a necessary thing to do. We have to do it, regardless of the darts or the daggers that are thrown at us. And so with that comes criticism, because children should not be determined eligible for something when they haven't had the opportunity to have, because there's a lack of equity in the educational system. So because of the disparities and because of the inequities, there's almost a punishment towards children who don't have, the haves and the have-nots. And um, so again, it really just kind of started with me way back when. And it's like, how do we get to the point where we're comfortable enough, regardless of what school district we're working at, what school building we're working in, who our supervisors are, that we are willing to stand up and do what's right on behalf of students, and always maintaining the ethical as well as the legal guidelines that we are bound by. So that's something that I push for, beyond just practicing that way. And, another thing too is the perception as a practitioner, when you are kind of forced to make certain decisions on behalf of the student, uh, what's in the best interest of the student. Again, the ethical and the legal, those parameters are so important to me in my work. It's being assertive, for as a woman of color, it may be perceived as aggression as opposed to being assertive and fighting for what is right, what is legal. And so that whole perception of the intersectionalities that we continue to struggle with in our field, just that one variable, being Black, being a Black woman, being put into this stereotype of being aggressive because you have a voice that is necessary at the table, and it is an important voice at the table when it comes to eligibility determinations. And so all of those things are very important to consider. But as far as my work, more currently, because I've been practicing over 20 years, and I love what I do. I love being there and advocating for children, and to give parents as well as the educators at the table some practical things to do to help children to learn and to do better so that they can thrive. Every person who needs help does not need an IEP. And that's something that I have to continually fight for. And I think that's something that as practitioners, we all need to fight for and not be afraid to speak on behalf of what's right and not just fall into a state of complacency. So that's very important. As far as my work with NASP, I was the delegate of Illinois for 6 years. I'm currently a delegate rep for the Central Region, so I'm on the board of directors currently, and I was on the board of directors during the fight for social justice to be a strategic goal for NASP, as well as a bigger fight was to have it as a standalone committee. So I'm very proud of that those were done. And it's because of the work that was done, with Dave and with the task force, with Nakima and so many others that gave me the ammunition I needed. So I was one of those people who was, at the table pulling up other documents while you're arguing against. I'm going to argue for something. So that's why I used it as an example with the with the panelists before this started, because sometimes you have to kind of detract a little bit. You're still listening, you're paying attention to what's going on at the table, but you have to advocate for what you know is right. And so each strategic goal of NASP does have a planning committee. So I was on that committee for the strategic goal, and we did a lot of work. Social justice was the focus of the regional leadership meetings for NASP leaders across the country, as well as the focus of this year, the 2020 NASP convention. Social justice was the highlight, the focus for it. So very proud of that and the work that NASP continues to do, and wanted to also continue that trend, or that have that to just filter down to the state, with the resolution for social justice and what ISPA plans to do in support of all children, youth, and families, so that there is some equity, to attack the intersectionalities and the discrimination that does exist in the state, and beyond that, as we network with other states. So there's so much work that needs to be done. I'm happy to be a part of it, to be a part of this discussion tonight. And I hope that everyone has an open ear and is willing to broaden their own perspectives as to what you can do as a clinician, as a practitioner, whatever your role is in school psychology. You have a voice that can be impactful. You know, just to kind of shift a little bit, being as a student in the training within the program, there was really no content that focused on social justice. Things were kind of intermittently hit on here and there, but it's not a class to take to learn about social justice. Social justice is one of those things that should be embedded across curriculum in all content areas, because it's more of a lifestyle. It's not a subject matter, for a class and a grade, and then you move on. And that was a conflict that, as a supervisor of practicum students and interns, that was the response. There was a student who, that was an area that was a need of growth, and the department at the institution, which I will not name, their resolve was to have the student to read some books, as though that was going to be a solve all for helping the student to really have build a better understanding and capacity for social justice and multiculturalism. So it takes a little bit more effort than that. And so I hope that as practitioners that we can all be willing to take on this fight and know that it's more of a lifestyle, not a lesson that you learn in the classroom.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Go ahead, Dr. Schreiber.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for including me in this panel. Yeah, I was saying before it started, it's great to meet and see the faces of some of the people that I've admired for so long, in Nakima and Catherine and Brea. So just briefly, so like my background, I was very fortunate. I went to a graduate school a while ago now. I guess I'm 47, so I'm talking now 20, 25 years ago. where the program had a strong multicultural focus. And that was a big reason why I came there. But I can't say that I had like my mind wrapped around social justice. I was pretty unaware of white privilege. Like I think I sort of had a sort of an open mind, but not a lot of knowledge or lived experience. I'd been privileged in a lot of ways. So I was very fortunate that I went to a graduate program that used the language of multiculturalism more than social justice, but the training, I would say now, like had a very strong social justice focus. So I was trained in a way to think that it was just normal, that that's what school psychology was. And I just didn't, and as a graduate student, I didn't have like a broader framework. My mentor was Ina Vasquez-Nuttall, who was a real pioneer in multicultural psychology, just nationally. So I was very fortunate. Um, as I worked as a practitioner, even with my privilege, like it was not very hard coming from a program with a multicultural focus to see issues of social justice everywhere. I felt like my eyes were closed for a good part of my life. And then once they were open, like I couldn't shut them again. Like you start to see it everywhere. And when I came into be a professor in 2003, I had never planned on doing that. And so you were supposed to, when you're a professor, when you're interviewing for tenure track job, you're supposed to have like a scholarly agenda, right? So, but I didn't really have one, right? But I wasn't thinking that way, but I had to say that. So I started looking, I'm like, okay, I knew that counseling psychology had started to use the language of social justice. And that's where I was looking. That's where I was pretty much getting all of my information at that time. In school psychology, I've come to learn and appreciate these people much more, but at least at the time, there really wasn't much of a visible presence of social justice in research and practice, or at least not called such. And so when I started to think about, okay, what's the contribution I might be able to make in terms of my research, my teaching from a professor point of view, initially kind of my mission was and continues to be kind of helping our field or playing a role in our field, kind of identifying what social justice might be defined and what it might look like in our field. And so for the last 15 years or so, that's been a big focus of my research, of my teaching. And I've been lucky enough to have some nice opportunities with NASP. I was a beneficiary of Catherine's advocacy because I'm on the social justice committee now. And this summer, I had a chance to work on the NAS anti-racism resolution, which hopefully is going to be passed soon. So I've had sort of different opportunities within NASP over the last few years to try to bring social justice more to the fore along with the others. As far as barriers, some of white male, like I'm privileged in just about every category. I don't know when ageism kicks in. I'm probably not quite there yet. I'm Jewish, so I have like really, so I'm not quite, but I'm pretty close to like every. And so I realized one of the ways that this privilege has played out is I think I haven't had as many barriers, and I've had some. My first department chair, like I was very excited about social justice. He and talking to students compared it to Satanism, right? He was a school psychologist, by the way. He was adamantly against it. He used to love to make homophobic and racist jokes outside my door. Like he was a very hostile, very, sort of an extreme kind of situation. So I did have one person who like specifically tried very early in my career to snuff that out. And so I left that university. That was before, then I came to Loyola actually, and then now I'm at Indiana. But mostly when I've done it, I think as a white male, when you do it, like there's a element of like, oh, what a good guy, good for you, like pat on the back. Whereas, I've seen my BIPOC colleagues, when they do some of the things, it's like, well, you have an agenda, or why are you focusing on this? So I think I certainly had some barriers, and I would say the general category is that I would label white fragility and institutional like status. Like I think a lot of universities now like to say they're about social justice. It sounds good. Like, what are you for, social injustice? Or are you for racial injustice? So it's kind of become a pretty easy thing to say in a way maybe that wasn't before. But then when you try to press them, like, what does that actually mean? And some of the things that Catherine talked about, that's where I've seen barriers. And it's not, aside from that first person, it's not usually an overt kind of like, what's wrong with you? It's sort of this sort of bureaucratic or passive aggressive, and kind of professors, there are lots of wonderful professors, including Dr. Banks, but in general, I feel like we can be kind of a a group that doesn't always take well to getting critical feedback. So I think I've had experiences with professors, typically around BIPOC students, or just the individually, or the culture of the college or university more broadly, where I have met resistance, I think like you see in public schools, but sort of a higher ed version of that, of like, no, we can't possibly be doing that. And a lot of like, we want to talk the talk, but walking the walk has, I think, been harder for a lot of people, at least that I've run across in universities. Not that I'm perfect at it myself, but I think where I've encountered barriers, it's usually been people like, oh, you want this to actually mean something? I thought we were just going to, put it on our website kind of thing.
Mhm. Thank you very much, each of you. Okay, so we're going to switch gears now and look at some of the key questions that our attendees submitted. We've categorized these into some broad areas and summarized them with some broader questions. So go ahead, Gabby, you want to share the first couple?
Sure. So what we'd like to do is sort of, move the conversations and really focus on action that can be taken, of course, inside of the schools. So specifically, what role can school psychologists have in influencing change in systems within and outside of schools that support racism? Um, for example, education, mental health, policing, housing, etc. What does a community or a school that values racial and social justice look like?
I can start with the first one. um, so I kind of alluded to a little bit of this during the last question. As far as the role of school psychologists in influencing change, part of it is just finding your voice and not being afraid of backlash, as long as you are sharing your voice in a respectful manner and it's adequate and accurate information, that you are staying within the parameters of your role as a school psychologist. And you're not there as the students or the family's personal advocate, but you are there to share information about that student and how that student can best be serviced based on your professional judgment in the school setting. So that does include the education and the mental health, policing sometimes in the face of discipline that is inappropriate if you are in the building that day of the occurrence. So even if you're not there, if you find out about it, you may have a voice in, what happens to that child. So um, finding your voice and not being afraid of repercussions, or, just be mindful that there may be some backlash because um, you are an employee of the district, of course, that you're servicing, but at the same time, building administrators are not always open to other perspectives. So you do have to do it in a respectful manner. Sometimes it's through someone else. You may have a go-between person to kind of share information if you're not invited into the room. um, if it's a discipline situation. But when it comes to education, consulting with teachers as well as with parents, giving suggestions, conducting classroom observations to really figure out what the dynamics are in the classroom. Is this is this a good seat for this student? Where should this student be placed? Maybe that student needs proximity seating in the classroom so that they're not in the back in the corner by themselves and they're distracted and causing problems. Try to figure out what the best learning environment is for that student and how you can help to facilitate that for the student to just enrich the entire classroom. Perhaps the entire classroom needs to be restructured. So with your training as a school psychologist in the schools, um, you have a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So tap into your own skill set. Collaborate with your colleagues if you're not sure. So many people are there. There are mentors available if you need a mentor, regardless of how long you've been in the field. I've been in the field over 25, no, not 25 years, so I'm not that long, but over 20 years. And I still collaborate with my colleagues because there are always situations where you may come up with a solution or a possible resolution, but it's still good to collaborate with your colleagues to get a second opinion, sometimes a third opinion. You really want to make sure that you're doing what's in the best interest. Mental health, as school psychologists, we are trained to be mental health providers in the building, and that is something that I advocate for. We have behavioral health teams in our buildings, and so be a part of those meetings and the planning of what goes on so that you are informed about what students are in need of support services. And if you can't provide direct services, you can always consult and collaborate with the teachers, the other mental health professionals in the building, the counselor, the social worker, as long as they're willing to collaborate with you, because those dynamics are different sometimes. But you can also be a source of information for the parents. So don't just project that responsibility onto the social worker or the counselor. We are trained to do it. So promote yourself as a mental health provider as you are. And, if you've forgotten all of the dynamics, you can look at the the strategic goals. NASP has mental health provider as a goal, so there's a lot of work that's being done. Policing, again, I've already addressed that, and housing, that one is more of a wraparound, so you may need to collaborate with people about that when it comes to student housing, or but as far as housing, school housing, then as far as placement, you have a direct role sometimes in whether or not a student, like how restrictive their learning environment is. So if you look at it from that standpoint, again, you have a voice. So find your voice and don't be afraid to share your voice. And if you need help finding your voice, you can always reach out to me for some suggestions. I can't tell you what to do, but I'm absolutely open to collaboration. I collaborate with a lot of people. We collaborate with one another. It's not just them getting my advice. I get theirs as well. So find someone that you can trust and collaborate with.
I'm happy to jump in here. Dr. Campbell had so many excellent examples of things that we can do as practitioners in the schools. I would just say also be mindful of the communities that you serve. We know that our field of school psychology is mostly white women. So when you're going into these different communities, you really have to be mindful of the students that you are there to support. And don't go in, I would say, with the mindset that you are there to save the students, but rather listen to the students, take into consideration their lived experience, and how can you support the students and families. I would say what a school or community that values racial and social justice looks like is actually listening to a student. If they've told you that they've been harmed in some kind of way by the teacher or by another student, just really believing them when they talk to you about certain situations that have happened to them. Again, their lived experience will shape how they interact with others, how they interact with their peers. And if we are in the position of power as the school psychologist in the building or as the administrator in the building, and every time a student comes to us to tell us something and we brush them off, they're no longer going to trust us. So we want to be a safe space for them. So not brushing off their experience if they said something happened to them, but really listening to them, offering them guidance, and really helping them in that situation, or lending, just sometimes listening goes a long way with students, but really not brushing off what they are telling you. They are trusting you as the adult in that building. So we really need to be open and responsive to what's happening. So I just personally feel like a school or a community that values that will actually take that on and will be mindful of different religions or different practices that happen in the community as well, and really thinking about the things that they're doing in the school building during that time and being mindful.
Thank you. Would either Dr. Schreiber or Dr. Banks like to add anything else to this one before we go on to the next question topic?
I think what my colleague shared from my perspective is pretty good, so I'm good. I don't know what Dr. Schreiber does.
Maybe if I could said one quick comment, since we're talking about historical. I think my sense of school psychology right now, and it was mentioned by Nikema, is field of mostly white women, is there's definitely a growing number of people that have been focused on social justice or racial justice that is seems to be more organized and more connected to each other perhaps than before, which is great. We have a lot of people in our field that really haven't thought about this, I think, until like the last like 6 months. And so if you happen to be one of those persons, my opinion is like, that's great. It's better for our field to have people that are thinking about racial and social justice than before, but realize that although it's new to you, it might be new to you to think about this. The people that you're interacting with, a lot of them, like this has been, this is not a new topic to them, and you want to, I think, make sure that whatever you're doing is not really about you, and it's not centered, and that you're not coming across, particularly if you're white or in a privileged category, that you're coming in and saying like, look at me, look at what I'm doing, and kind of reaching out and like asking people to kind of keep validating you. I think really what the things that were talked about, like listening and take, really is kind of a way of like really just trying to learn and catch up for what you miss, because there's the problems that whatever topic we're addressing, education, mental health, policing, housing, these are deeply rooted problems, and we've had systemic injustice, for the history of the United States. So just, I think it can be, I think some people sometimes make mistakes, like in their enthusiasm, they come in, they either feel like I'm going to solve it now, or isn't this great? And, and don't kind of realize that other people have been thinking about this and been in a different position for a long time. And I think people are going to welcome your involvement, but come at it with a sense of humility, and kind of more from a listening stance and like a problem solver. I'm going to fix this. We now have the white savior or the really smart school psychologist that no one else could fix it before, but now I can. I think just kind of having that level of humility and open-mindedness to what you're doing is really important.
Excellent. Thank you so much, all of you, for your insights there. We're going to switch now and talk a little bit more about our specific practice of school psychology and the key aspects of assessment, eligibility, and discipline. And so we'd love to hear any ideas you have for how school psychologists and trainers can address disproportionality in these areas, including inequities and resources that would disadvantage Black, Indigenous, and people of color or English learning students, and how we might integrate restorative practices into our discipline and discipline approaches in schools. Who'd like to begin?
I can.
Thank you.
Yeah, from a trainer perspective, so just a little bit of context. At Illinois State, I teach the cognitive assessment course for our students. And so all of our first year students take that class their first semester. They're in the midst of that now. It's very stressful. I'm sure that many of us remember taking those types of courses back when we were in graduate school. One of the things that I really focus on in that class, and it's different from the way that I was trained, and I would venture to say that it's probably very different from the way that many folks are trained in school psych, relevant to COG assessment and assessment in general, is by first fostering discussion surrounding the historical context of how psychology was founded, and the eugenics movement, and discussions of how certain sorts of tests weren't necessarily made with the benefits of Black and Brown people in mind. And the thing that I really try to stress in that class in particular is that assessments are the assessment measures that we use are simply tools, right? And so although we spend an entire semester talking about cognitive assessment, and they go on to spend an entire semester talking about the academic and social emotional sorts of assessments, I'm pretty frank with them in discussions that we have surrounding the fact that these tests weren't made for Black and Brown people. And just really pushing them to be skeptical and ask questions and do their research. And when they're out in their field placements with, those of you that are gracious enough to supervise them, the practitioners, really, encouraging them to ask questions. And not just take things at face value, right? And kind of get out of the practice of just giving the WISC or the WJ or whatever assessment, because that's what we do, right? But rather intentionally thinking about each method of assessment that we're using, because those assessments go on to inform the placements that kiddos get and the interventions that they get. And I think sometimes that's hard, right? So I think that we have a lot of hard conversations, particularly with many of my white students who are just completely shocked, at how history played out. We read the book, even the rat was white. I don't know if that's one that folks have heard of, but I would encourage people to read that one by Guthrie. And it just really details the founding of psychology. And when you can give students that preface, right, I think everything that they go into for the rest of their training, and when they're in their practicum sites and they're learning new assessments and sitting in meetings, I think that folks are going to think about things in a way that's a little bit more skeptical rather than just taking everything at face value. And again, I think that the way that we're training students, and I think Dr. Schreiber talked about this a little bit, the field has shifted. So even though when I was trained, I don't feel like I got a ton of that. And I kind of had to do my own work, to be perfectly honest, surrounding educating myself on the history and how that impacts kids and families in schools. I do think that school psychology is doing a better job today in terms of making sure that we are being a little bit more mindful about how we're training our students.
Thank you. Go ahead. Who wants to add to that? Is there anything else particular to this topic that anyone wants to add in before we transition to the next one?
I might say one more thing.
Oh. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah,
no,
I'll just say one more thing. Yeah, the cultural competence, right? I think that word is typically pretty triggering for me, right? I think that making sure, again, with our students, one thing that we try to do is make sure that they understand that it's not cultural competence that they're seeking, right? So we do a lot of we have a lot of discussion surrounding the fact that, like, you're never going to be this culturally competent person, right? What we want you to do is to learn how to think for yourself, how to go research, how to set goals for yourself surrounding your social justice journey. But that really what we're aiming to do is to get them to engage in culturally responsive services and recognizing that work never stops. Dr. Campbell.
As you were speaking about cultural competence, I didn't lose what I was going to say, but just to kind of, something that came to mind was the idea of when we travel, when we're going to a foreign country, we tend to invest time in learning about that culture, about the country, about, we try to learn some words that will help us to function in the country. We do some research, right? But when it comes to working with children of different backgrounds, are we doing that? So that was a perfect example that you provided as far as doing that research, because that is something that's very important. And it really does impact the disproportionality that we see in special ed, as far as the resources, the inequalities, the inequities, and the disadvantages of minoritized groups of people, because there has to be an investment in knowing who you're working with and how they function in order to best serve them. If you don't understand how Black children are raised in different communities, especially in an urban area, regardless if you're in urban or rural, I went to grad school in a rural community and I had to go to some homes, I had to work in those schools. So very different dynamics. But so you have to learn about the culture in which you're working in order to best serve the children that you have been charged to help. So if you're not willing to invest the time, to me, it's unethical to make decisions at the table when it comes to special education, because children who have not been educated are very frequently placed into special education, and special ed is not a band-aid for success. How much growth is a child going to make just because they have an IEP? And that's a totally different conversation to have. That's not really, there's not enough time in this town hall for that. But just to get you to thinking about the reality that the decisions that you make are so very important, because they contribute to disproportionality. And sometimes you know, the cultural competence is not indicated in the decisions that are made on behalf of students. So you really have to be cognizant of the decisions and the long-term implications to the decisions that are made as school psychologists.
That's such a
Excellent.
great point. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think for really briefly for schools as a professor, like what I see all the time is, people go into our field wanting to do good things, right? There's the universal reason to go in. It's a helping profession, right? So no one goes into school psychology to cause harm. And so I think people come into our field like, okay, I want to be a helper, and then they go to graduate programs that, like mine that like it loves, is very positive about school psychology, so get involved. So people have like pride in their field, which is good. And then I think it's hard sometimes to have the mind shift that what you are being trained to do might actually be harmful, and that our field, consciously or not, intentionally or not, has engaged in harmful practices. And I think it's hard I think, being able to kind of get past that or kind of balance, okay, I'm here to be a helper, but I might be doing some things that are harmful. I may not have been aware of it, or maybe a bias, but I think I've just noticed that I think I've seen in our students, like over the 3 years, like kind of coming to that reality. And you see some people get kind of like denial about it, some people get angry about it, but I think like finding a way to kind of work, if you're in that position, to kind of work through that and realize, like, it's more nuanced. School psychology does a lot of great things, but it also has caused harm, and kind of figuring out why, with the background of the history of that, and really making some conscious choices about what you're doing, as opposed to kind of more rotely kind of administering measures that you were trained to give accurately.
Awesome. Thank you for those incredible insights. Each of
Mary,
you,
can
so
I
we're
just
going to,
add? Can I just add one
yeah,
more thing quick? And it kind of ties into what Dr. Banks was sharing as far as her teaching the cognitive class, because there's so much more behind those scores. So the scores don't determine eligibility. There's so much other data that you have to collect and make decisions. That's all.
thank you. All right, so we're going to switch gears and shift now to the consultation aspects of our role. Go ahead, Gabby.
Sure. So what steps can school psychologists take to involve pretty much everyone, colleagues, students, parents, administrators, in social racial justice efforts? And could you recommend specific programs or PD books? Dr. Brea mentioned even the rat was white, especially now during remote or hybrid learning.
So one thing I would say that school psychologists could use, especially since we work to develop it, is the lesson plan, the social racial, and now I'm having a blank on the name, but we developed the lesson plan, and it gives activities that can be done with your colleagues in the buildings. Every year when we bring on new hires, since we developed the plan, we implemented the privilege walk with all of our new hires, because we wanted to set a tone for the expectation of our department and what we expect as administrators that our colleagues are doing out in the field. So we always started with the privilege walk. We weren't able to do that this year with them due to virtual learning, but we were still able to do a presentation with them to really talk about microaggressions, and still do parts of the lesson plan, and thinking about our own personal bias when we're working with students or just interacting with people who don't necessarily look like us. So we try to develop and give resources for people to take an inventory of their own personal bias, take an inventory of your own community. What does your circle of friends look like, or even your healthcare providers? If you look at your list of people that you see, are any of them minoritized people who support you? I know some of my colleagues that I work with, she makes it a point to make sure that she finds Black doctors for her son, because representation absolutely matters. So I would say even starting there with something as small as the privilege walk to kind of look at where you are in line with things. That was one thing that we did with the race and equity work group that really stood out to me. As a Black woman, I found myself in the back of the line, which was not surprising to me. But one thing that I took away from that was, even though I was in the back, we all still ended up in the same place. So your circumstances don't necessarily dictate where you will end up, but sometimes your situation does allow a little bit more work. And Catherine said one thing earlier, where when you're advocating for students, it's easy to be seen as the angry Black woman. And that's something that we have to sit with often and just really think about. I would say just working as an administrator in Chicago Public Schools and being the manager of the north side of the city, that's one thing that I frequently run into, I could say. Principals often want to go around me. They want to talk to everybody else but me. But fortunately, at the time, we had a director who would send them right back to me because I am the person that you need to speak to. So microaggressions happen daily, and we have to face them and deal with them and call them out. That's also something that I have to do working on the north side of the city when a principal comes to me and says why their school needs more than another school. And as a district leader, I have to remind them that no, every student deserves the same supports as your school does, or the same supports as how often your school psychologist is there. So it's a constant battle. The work does not end. So we just have to do our best to really be responsive, but it does take having those tough conversations as well. You may have to call people to the line for their actions, and it can be uncomfortable, but if you know you are on the right side of things, I think that helps a lot.
I can jump in next. I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly about things that I feel like folks can do, because I can give y'all an entire list of books, podcasts, TV shows, right? Whatever, movies. But I think that's part of what it's about. I think sometimes people think that the work is just supposed to happen during your 9 to 5, but it doesn't, right? I think if you're somebody that's, excuse me, committed to social justice, you take it personally. I was talking with one of my students, I guess that was yesterday, and we were talking about the show on HBO Max, Lovecraft Country, right? And I don't know if folks have heard about that one, but it's a horror show, and nonetheless, they do an excellent job. I mean, an excellent job of discussing, things that happen historically to Black people, right? And I think it fosters conversations among folks on platforms like Twitter. Which, another side point, I think that it's not just about podcasts, books, movies, TV shows, whatever. I do think that there are some social media spaces where folks can have the opportunity to grow. I talk to my students about this all the time. The way that I particularly use Twitter is to collaborate with folks, and I fostered a ton of relationships. I even think Dr. Schreiber and I, we really met that way, but being intentional about who you're following, right? And so I encourage my students to get on there, and I say, go look at who I'm following. There are a bunch of school sites on there. There are a bunch of people on there that are committed to social justice action and being intentional, not just when you're at work, at your desk, at your school, but what are you allowing to take up your space, when you're at home? And I think that people that are truly committed to that, it's important to just really immerse yourself in that type of content, because then you're going to be able to better talk about it. I think one thing that my students will say often is that, well, Brea, like, I feel like this was wrong and I wanted to say something, but like, I just didn't have the language. And because I didn't have the language, I was nervous, like I got butterflies, my hands started sweating, whatever. And I couldn't get the words out in that moment. And, it's just like working with kids with autism. We give them scripts. Right? We give them scripts for what to say when they're nervous about conversation starters, or when they don't know, right? Same thing here. If you're reading and you're engaging in work and you're constantly learning and engaging with the material, not just when you're at work, when the time comes for you to be ready to speak up, you're going to be ready because you'll have that language. So that's what I would encourage people to do, especially those of us that aren't students anymore and you're practicing. The work, the professional development doesn't just happen you know, in the workplace. For folks that are truly committed to social justice change and equity, it has to happen, you know, when you're at home too.
I loved all of that. Thank you.
Anything
I
else
think
for this one? Go ahead.
I think another thing too is, you know, being in the schools, I think team meetings are so important. When we sit down and we have conversations, you know, in some of my schools, we've been fortunate enough to have consistently have a team meeting to start our day on our team day. And that has proven to be so beneficial, because it builds the camaraderie with your team. There's a trust, because people know the students. You know, you're talking about the students that may need some support at some point in time. You're talking about students who are due for evaluations or reevaluations or referrals, but it's, you know, informal conversations. But it's during these conversations where you can even address some of these disparities that we experience in education. We talk about, you know, um, you know, who may be in need and who can definitely benefit from intervention. So it helps us to better plan and to really delve deep into the needs of the students without a formal meeting. We're not going deep into anything because, you know, legally we can't do too much like that, but it really does help us to address some of these social justice and racial inequities. So if you're not having team meetings in your buildings, please fight for them, because they can truly be advantageous when you're really trying to determine what's in the best interest of the child and not what's in the best interest of the administrators in the building.
Yeah, along those lines, you know, it was mentioned before that social justice is one of NAS's strategic goals. I believe so also is leadership development. And to me, those two go together, right? So you can have the desire to bring about a change in social justice or racial justice, but be nervous or have butterflies or not always have the capacity to bring it out. And I think we all lead in different ways. And so I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of leadership that it's about being the person that's always in charge or like having a formal title. School psychologists are often in great positions to be kind of connectors. You know, we hear a first grade teacher say something that she's really passionate about, and then a fifth grader teacher says something similar. They don't interact with each other that much because they're in their classrooms. They don't realize, but we know that, right? And so I think sometimes we're in a good, there are things that we can, be in a really good position to kind of be on more in the front of and take more of a visible leadership. But I think there's also, we can use our role, if we're thinking of it this way, to help other people get together, and we don't always have to single-handed be the person kind of in charge. So for me, like the leadership skill is kind of bringing out the best of your capacity, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert or behind the scenes kind of person, and trying to put yourself in positions that are most suited to you, and also kind of having that same mindset for those around you and thinking like, how do we get the most out of this group around us? And sometimes that might be just being a facilitator or creating a space for someone else's voice to be elevated in a way that it might not otherwise have been if there wasn't you kind of thinking of them and looking out that way. So I think just kind of tapping into your leadership skills and your using teams can result in having much bigger changes between colleagues, students, parents, and administrators than anything we can do just by ourselves.
Thank you. All right. So the next area we wanted to look at, based on the questions from our attendees, was how you would go about the work of racial and social justice advocacy in a setting where you are combated with an unsupportive climate. So how can school psychologists assist privileged group members in recognizing subtle forms of racism, such as colorblindness and institutional policies that favor some groups at the cost of maintaining disadvantages for others? And how might we influence colleagues, parents, and community members to recognize the importance of these issues, particularly in a setting that is less diverse racially or is overtly unsupportive to examining inequities?
I have a few thoughts. I think on this one, particularly given, that my area of research is microaggression. One of the things we talked a ton about when I was at CSU is that there is a spectrum. There are folks that are going to be all the way on one side, and there are going to be other folks that are going to be all the way on the other side. And I think that particularly school psychologists who hold marginalized identities, I think that you have to be careful. And I think about myself, and I think about my Black and brown students and women that I train. I think it's important that we are pushing folks forward, and at the same time, you have to learn how to protect your space. And so I do a lot of talking with white people about what you're going to do, right, when you're in these particular settings, because you hold power and privilege that Black and brown folks often don't hold. And so what I tell my students who are Black and brown is that they get to decide what it looks like, right? When it comes to experiencing microaggressions or even witnessing them, the ball is in your court, right? And I don't police their tone, right? If they're in with someone and they feel like something happens that is inequitable, or they feel like it's microaggressive, a lot of times they'll say things like, well, Brea, like, I just feel like I'm not gonna say it in a way that's respectful or in a way that's gonna be heard. And what I tell them is that it's most important that it is heard, right? Because when you go home and you have to deal with the consequences of potentially not speaking up when you wish you would have, to me, that does something to folks, right? And it contributes to burnout. And with white folks, what I try to get people to understand is that you've got to do the work, like I said earlier, behind the scenes, so that you do have language, and recognize and get people in your school setting or wherever you're working, find people who are also committed to making change, and also may have done some work relevant to social justice and can recognize when these instances happen. That way you're not just by yourself, right? But when I say there's a spectrum, what I mean is that there are going to be some people that aren't going to budge. And I think that is sometimes hard for us to understand as school psychologists who want to bring everybody along, right? That may be hard to understand, that there are going to be people in particular settings that are just not interested at all, no matter what you do, no matter how good your training is, no matter who you bring in to talk about XYZ, they're not budging, right? And that may be difficult to hear because, again, we want to get people to come along with us. But I think that when we just keep trying and trying and trying and we're not seeing the progress that we want, again, that contributes to burnout. So I say that because I think that sometimes, folks take, progress not being made as quickly as what we wanted as personal. But I think that we've got to understand that sometimes we got to target our focus, and that different interventions are going to work differently for different sets of people. And so you got to figure out how to enter in. Often I find that getting folks, white folks in particular, to be able to identify with class inequities or gender inequities or sexual orientation or religion or whatever, right? Sometimes figuring out how to get people to identify in works, and sometimes it doesn't because they're still colorblind. So just finding the intervention that's going to work for the population that you're trying to target.
I loved everything about what you said, because those are definitely some challenges that we continue to have in Chicago Public Schools. Even the work that we're doing now, we still have some who are just not on board and who may never be on board. And I'm actually glad to hear you say that, Dr. Banks, because there's one particular person that I thought about having a conversation with, but I think that would be at the expense of my own health, especially considering, on a daily basis, we are dealing with microaggressions from teachers, sometimes from colleagues, from building administrators, and we really do have to protect our peace as well. I want to say one thing that goes back to listening. When someone tells you something happened to them, believe them. Don't try to look at it from your own perspective, but really hear what they're saying. One example that I give when we do this presentation with principals is that, I went into a school to do an observation of one of my staff members. I told them who I was and why I was there. In that space, I was the only Black person in that office. They asked me to wait while they got the school psychologist, so I sat down. Next thing I know, here comes a young Black girl into the office looking for her guardian. So right away, I knew exactly what was happening in that moment because I was the only Black person in that office. So she looks around and she says, they told me my so-and-so was here. And they were like, oh, and she's like, no. And they said, maybe they're in the other office. So she goes and looks. Case manager eventually comes to get me and he says the same thing. Oh, they told me the parent was here. No. So we go up to the meeting of the, I'm observing my site, but we go up to the meeting, and whose meeting is it? It's this young lady's who they called to the office to tell her that her guardian was there. So in that moment, I was harmed. And while they might not have thought anything about what they did, they harmed me, and I had to sit with that, and I had to work through that and continue to be a professional and do my job. And so when I got back to my office and shared this story with my colleagues, one of them, they were both appalled, but one was like, I would never have imagined that is what was happening. I was like, you wouldn't, but that is also your privilege as a white woman. I knew immediately what was happening in that instance. So it's really important to just, listen to people and their experience when they share that with you. And that may change one mind at a time. Like Dr. Schreiber said, he got to school and his eyes were open, and now they're open all the time. So you just never know what's going to happen, but it's important to speak up, I would say, for sure.
Thank you for sharing that. Anything else, Dr. Schreiber or Dr. Campbell, to add to this topic? Okay. So our next topic then is looking at university settings in a little more detail. What does advocacy for anti-racism look like in a university training setting? And how can our university and field supervisors better support Black, Indigenous, and people of color students and advocate for increased diversity in our training programs?
I love this question. I don't know if y'all mind me jumping back in here, because I think it is so. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think it's so important. So I guess I have a few thoughts. I think that from a university standpoint, when it comes to recruitment, right? And I've had several conversations with not necessarily colleagues within my school psychology program at Illinois State, but on our campus and other graduate programs and on some other campuses. What tends to happen during the admissions process is that people will look at GRE scores and they'll look at GPAs and they'll look at all these numbers and whatnot, and will give excuses for why our program isn't as diverse as it should be, right? And people will say things like, well, it's because we're admitting the top students, or well, because it's not our fault that so-and-so's GPA or GRE score isn't as high as whomever. And what I'm going to say is that I think that we have to recognize that those numbers are rooted in racism, right? I'm just going to make it flat out plain, right? I'm going to say that they're rooted in racism. And people will say, well, okay, maybe there's some evidence that the GRE might not be the most equitable measure of whatever, but GPA, that's a good predictor. It shows us how well they did in college. Well, guess what? When Black and brown students go to predominantly white institutions, they have to deal with tremendously more than their white counterparts. When they show up on the university campus, they're not just, getting this school experience where they don't have to worry about racism, right? And in some cases for women of color, right, being a woman of color on campus, my research interests that I talked about earlier, we're particularly interested in examining the cognitive consequences of racial microaggression. And we found evidence when people are microaggressed against, something happens in that moment. And so when we look at GPA and we say, well, this person's GPA isn't as good as this other person's, we're not looking at what that GPA really means, right? And then when you start to talk about other issues such as, economic equity, right? For students that are doing college on their own and paying their own way and working, right? There are all these other factors that contribute to GPA other than somebody's intelligence or grit, point blank. And so if we want to diversify the field of school psychology, we will decide to diversify the field of school psychology. We will commit in our graduate programs to being intentional about recruiting students, to being intentional about the students that we admit to our programs, to being intentional about where grant funding goes, right? And to me, that is very specific anti-racist practice. It doesn't get any simpler than that. If you have the intention to make the field more diverse, you will begin to recognize the inequities that already exist for students of color, and you will do something about it. And then you won't just bring them to your program and say, okay, you're here, go forth and do it. You will think about ways to make sure that you retain them, that they're included, that their experience is one that is a good one, right? You're going to recognize, right? I tell my students of color all the time. I just had a conversation with some of our grad students here in our psychology department, where I told them, look, you're going to experience XYZ. Okay, you're going to. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when you do, these are the things that I want you to do. I want you to check in with your colleagues who identify as people of color. I want you to come and talk to me about it, right? So I think when we exist in this colorblind world, sometimes as university faculty, we just assume that, oh, it's not gonna happen. But recognizing that the people of color in our programs are going to have vastly different experiences than their white counterparts. I think when we can recognize that, then we can be a little bit more intentional about the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. And then for white students, again, making sure that we are helping them unlearn a lot of what they learned in K through 12 education surrounding the historical nature of everything, of education, of psychology. Because I think a lot of times we just say, you know, well, what do we want to do? How do we want to teach our students to engage in culturally responsive practice? But the problem stems from the fact that not just white folks, I think all of us, you know, are raised in a society where we're not taught what really happened, right? And when we're not taught what really happened and how, you know, education in the U.S. is inequitable for many people, then we assume that if I do this intervention, then this child should be okay. Or if I engage in this particular practice, if I use this particular frame of thinking and the person's not responding, then it's on them. Right. But if we do a better job of really educating our students in our school psychology programs about all the ways that education and school psychology has failed over the years, I think that when they have that different mindset, again, they're going to be a little bit more intentional about the interventions that they choose and how they show up in meetings with parents and how they discuss scores. So that's I could talk all day about that, but I'll end there with my 2 cents.
That was wonderful. Anything else others have to add to insights in this topic?
I'll just add, you know, just keeping in mind diversity, inclusion, and equity. You have to have all 3 of those in order to really see a difference in all of these things that we are talking about tonight. Can't have 2, can't have 1. You have to have diversity, inclusion, and equity. Because if you have diversity and equity, but people are not included, they're still out there. It's not going to make a difference in the overall outcome. So all 3 are very equally important and necessary collectively. That's all.
Thank you. We're going to move into our last question. What are some ways for associations such as ISPA to better advocate for racial and social justice at the state level within our organizational structure and operations, as well as in support of our members and colleagues? Who would like to start?
I will. I have some ideas. I was just, you know, thinking about this recently, more so this week in preparing for tonight. You know, and I really think that ISPA, this is a huge step for ISPA to not only adopt a resolution on racial and social justice or injustice, but to have a town hall to, you know, better service members and to have this Q&A time. I think to have, you know, racial justice under something is an injustice. I think ISPA should, you know, broaden the scope in regards to racial and social justice, as far as, you know, maybe having a committee, a standalone committee for social justice, and develop ways to infuse the work of social justice across all committees, because it's not an entity of itself. It's something that has to be infused in the work, so that it's not like, oh, I'm going to a social justice workshop, or I'm going to, it's going to a workshop regardless of the topic, but social justice is infused in that because of the dynamics of social justice. It is addressing diversity, inclusion, and equity. So that's not something that's standalone in and of itself, but the work to make sure that the like the workshops and the activities of the different committees of the association have social justice kind of embedded into their work. I think that would be huge for the state association, as well as the state level advocacy, because the advocacy work is based on the direction of the association. So if it's built into the platform of the association, then it's going to trickle through everything.
I like that, Dr. Campbell, and I think that's something that we think about a ton, as faculty members, not just including that one day of the diversity topic on our syllabus, but making sure that it is infused into the overarching course content. And so I think about that relevant to different professional development series and things like that 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 ISPA may, put forth. I remember given a talk back during the conference last year, and some of the feedback that I received from one or two individuals was that they were annoyed with my presentation because they felt like, they signed up for this one very school psyche type topic, and then I had the audacity to infuse social justice all up into it, right? So they feel like they hadn't necessarily signed up for that. And, one of the things that I think I would, potentially push, ISPA to do is to make it a requirement, right? When we're engaging in these professional development series, right? People are planning their talks. How are you intentionally thinking about issues of social justice when you're planning your talk, right? So if you're planning a talk about BMOD or academic, whatever, how are you infusing issues of social justice into that talk? Because I think that'll change the norms, right? I think it'll begin to get our students and our practitioners in the field to understand that social justice issues are a part of every aspect, right? It should be something that permeates all aspects of service delivery. But I don't think that the field was necessarily set up that way, and I don't know that everybody thinks about social justice that way. So that's something that I might recommend, right? It shouldn't just be these diversity topics or these social justice oriented topics, but everything that we're doing on a daily basis has to consider equity and justice.
Thank you. We have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to know if you guys could respond to just one quick question as a closing thought. If you could recommend one thing that psychologists go out and do tomorrow to advance their work as social justice advocates, what would you recommend?
It's a tough question.
Okay.
I would think, I guess my mind goes to if we have to just pick one thing and a place to start, my mind goes to self-awareness and getting more in tune with yourself, your own biases, your own gaps in knowledge. And I agree very strongly with the statement. I think it was Catherine said much earlier that it's like very mission oriented. Like, why does this matter to you? Like, what? There are the things that you can translate into what you're going to do, but I think the most effective change strategies are things that come from like an authentic place within yourself, and and having a self-awareness of like what your purpose is, why this matters, what you need to know, what you don't. So there are lots of things we could do, but I think kind of the first one is, because there's so many books and videos, and like those are all really important, but I think kind of starting with the self and your own values and connecting the work to the values that brought you into the field is the thing that comes to mind as a starting place.
I finally came up with something. I don't know that this is like the best thing that I would say that folks could do, but it's an idea to start. Go start a Twitter account if you don't have one already. And if you want your Twitter to be separate from like your personal Twitter, that works, because I started over. And, you know, be intentional about who you follow. So go find Dave, go find Celeste Malone, go find Sherry Proctor, go find all these people
Find Bray
and
Banks.
follow who they, and Bray Banks, yeah, follow me too, at Doc Banks for. Go follow these people that they're following, right? And you don't have to post a ton, but you can just look and see what they're retweeting and what they're posting, and engage in the conversation that way. I tell my students, you know, when y'all wake up in the morning, what do? You grab your phone and you start scrolling. So add Twitter, right? Add academic Twitter to one of those things that you're scrolling through in the morning, just to give you some insight into what's happening in the world, and you know, get some insight into some different resources that might be out there.
Awesome. Nikki, Dr. Campbell, anything else for a closing thought?
I think Dr. Banks and Dr. Schreiber definitely gave good examples. You definitely want to do a self-inventory and really be open to what you see. Some of it is going to be absolutely heartbreaking. It is. And it's going to take a lot of work on our part. Just be mindful that you're not causing more harm in trying to be helpful as well, is one thing that I would say to do. We all, I feel, have good intentions, and our work comes from a good place. So try not to take any, I don't want to say negative feedback, but try not to take anything that's not necessarily going the way that you want it to go immediately, personally, and give up on the work. But really, it's a long haul. It's a journey. And those of us who have been living in this for our lives, you know, it takes daily work, and it's something that I think for a while, I saw an article just the other day on Facebook where one woman thought that she had never experienced racism, and instead she realized that she had just really been numbing herself to it and really ignoring what had been happening to her and the microaggressions that had, you know, come her way. So really just being mindful that you're not causing additional harm in certain situations, I would say, is important.
Thank you.
And I'll just say real quick that there's always room for growth. So there's something, you know, challenge yourself to learn something new or to grow in an area, which kind of ties into the self-awareness and self-reflection. And two, that, you know, we've given examples and you know, things tonight, but there's so many pathways to you coming into your own voice and also finding your own way to become that person who is an exemplar of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So find your own voice, find your own path, and find your own space to grow, because there's room to grow.
Thank you, Dr. Schreiber, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Banks, and Ms. Hudson. We truly appreciated all of your insights and expertise, and cannot thank you enough for making the time for ISPA and all of our colleagues. To everyone who was interested in joining tonight but would like the conversation to continue, ISPA would like to partner with you in that. And so we ask you to share your feedback with us. You'll receive a feedback survey via the email that you use to register. And then to consider joining one of the regional follow-up go-to meetings. If you are a current ISPA member, your regional director will be reaching out with details. And then in October, there is a joint conference for the Illinois Association and the Wisconsin Association. It's all webinars, and during lunch on October 23rd, there will be an open forum related to social justice where we will pick up with topics we weren't able to discuss tonight. If you're interested in joining our work on the ISPA Social Justice Work Group, you can find out information about that on our website, as well as information about these, the fall conference and the open forum. Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining tonight, and please be safe, be brave, and be strong as advocates. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.